I'm mad. I'm mad this movie did this to me. No, you know what? Forget what I just said. I'm happy. I'm so happy I sat down in a theater next to my sister to watch this movie. I'm happy because this, frankly, is a kind of euphoric insanity that I only feel in the rarest of moments. I can relate to Movie Bob's now patented rant on this movie because I literally am too shaking after watching it. Not with rage, though, no. Just pure, uncontrollable confusion. How did a movie like this get the green light to come out? What Warner Brothers executive looked at the onslaught of comic book films on the market, said to themselves, we need to compete with this, turned to this script and said, yep, that'll do it. If you've seen the trailers, you've seen the better version of this movie, and this review is going to be all over the place starting now. It's also going to get spoiler heavy very soon, so if you must know what I think without spoilers, the short version is this. It's bad. This movie is bad. I hate it. I hate it more with every passing second. I don't recommend it to anyone except maybe as a bizarre comedy, and in terms of comic book films from this decade, it's second only to Fantastic Four in pure incomprehensibility. What was the story? There was none. The story to Batman v Superman doesn't exist. There's a plot, sure, there's a sequence of events that follow one after the other, even if the editing and pacing make even that hard to follow, but there's no theme, there's no solid characterization, there's no substance. There's an opportunity for substance. Heck, the idea of pitting Batman and Superman against each other is inherently compelling, not because of their abilities, but because of who they are as people and what they represent. But the Batman and Superman of this film don't represent anything, or at least not anything close to what the movie thinks they do. And I'm sorry to say it, but it needs to be said, we needed another Superman and Batman movie in this universe before we put them against each other. No, not because that's the way Marvel did it, but because this movie is convinced we know the ins and outs of how these characters think going in. The movie acts like it's telling a story about the prototypical Superman and Batman, but neither of them stand for what their characters typically stand for. Henry Cavill's Clark Kent is a lot like Daniel Craig's James Bond. They both started out in a movie deconstructing the archetype of the original character for a modern age that feels it has to justify their continued existence, and said movies end with them having supposedly fully formed into the classic version of themselves that people know and love, only for the following movies to still have them wavering in their convictions, yet desperately trying to convince the audience that they've fully grown into the all-encompassing ire they're supposed to be. So instead of the experience of Man of Steel making him more steadfast in his beliefs in the good of mankind and his own mission to save it, Clark in this film is still brooding and still seems to only save people out of a desire to uphold his dead father's vision of him, rather than any morality of his own. The movie really falters on this end, as the whole premise of the first act is seeing how the world views the idea of Superman, but this amounts to nothing. We get some scenes of newscasters theorizing on Clark's intentions, we spend most of the movie having him either make questionable decisions or be blamed for atrocities committed by Lex Luthor, and then we just drop all of it, and how the rest of the world views him becomes completely irrelevant because all the movie actually cares about is what Bruce thinks of him. And Bruce... well, we'll get to Bruce in a second, but suffice it to say, all he represents in this film is a violent and maniacal need for control, not unlike another certain someone in the movie. Speaking of which, Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, to use my token MCU comparison, is a lot like Ultron to me. For both characters, people seem intent to throw a fit that it's not like the comics, and while I'm more invested in Comics Lex than Comics Ultron, both characters only ever needed 3 things to be a success for me. At least a tiny bit of menace, tons of egomania, and a solid acting performance. And I just know that what I'm about to say is gonna get me drawn and quartered, but for all I think this movie utterly fails, I actually kinda like him. I know, right? I swear to God, all of the people who come out of this movie, and I'm the one guy who won't praise Batman or Wonder Woman, but will let this guy off with a pass, just because all of his scenes at least made me laugh on purpose? At least I can kind of read a motivation into Lex. The dude is obsessed with power, and a being like Superman being around threatens his sense of control. Simple. Got it. Putting aside the accuracy to the comics, I don't know how he's the one part of the film everyone has a huge problem with. I hate myself. But seriously, I'm astounded at the number of people coming out of this movie calling Ben Affleck the new definitive Batman. This psychopath? This complete idiot? There's only one thing that separates Bruce and Lex in this film, and that one thing is the single biggest problem with the whole movie, that kneecaps the whole shebang. This movie is built on a conflict that doesn't work even a little bit. So you know how in Daredevil Season 2 we devote an entire extended conversation to Punisher and Daredevil's philosophical disagreements, and how that's the basis for their clashing, and how the trailers for this movie made it seem like that's the route we were gonna take?
Civil liberties are being trampled on in your city. People living in fear. He thinks he's above the law.
The Daily Planet criticizing those who think they're above the law is a little hypocritical. What'd you say?
Well, forget all that, because outside of that scene, there's not even a single moment where the feud between Bats and Soups stems from anything related to ideology or opinion or methodology. Bruce is hell-bent on brutally murdering Clark because of the damage done to Wayne Towers during Man of Steel, and that's it. Everything else is the result of broad manipulation on Lex's part, and then we get the typical comic book fight that could have been resolved had the heroes just exchanged a couple of sentences. I mean, geez, you guys, this is about as flimsy as the fight between Iron Man and Thor in Avengers, except where that fight was largely incidental and mostly served to reestablish some things about Thor. This fight was the crux of the whole movie. I'm someone who likes to think that the comic book movie genre deserves more credit than it's given, largely because a lot of movies have been at least partially idea-driven. This movie could have been that, but instead it's literally all an excuse for action. This is the type of movie that people who hate comic book movies will use as evidence for why they're shallow and pointless. And the fight only lasts maybe 4 or 5 minutes before it's resolved with one of the stupidest moments I've ever seen in a movie, period. Oh yes, we're talking about that scene.
Y'all ready for this?
Batman has Superman pinned to the ground, is about to impale him, then in a bit of completely unnatural dialogue, Clark lets slip that his mom is named Martha, which instantaneously flips a switch in Bruce's head where he decides to let Clark live, and nary 30 seconds later, the two are forming a plan to save Martha, who's been kidnapped by Lex. The Martha scene kills this movie. It's the pivot on which this whole film turns, and it's broken. The entire point of this movie is the conflict, and it's shattered with the most shallow of coincidences. More importantly, though, this scene is what kills this interpretation of Batman for me. Bruce Wayne has often been accused of being a bit of a mama's/papa's boy who refused to grow up, and lets his memories of his parents dictate his actions far more than they reasonably should. But this is taking it to a whole other level. This movie would have me believe that the Batman who is going to carry this cinematic universe for the foreseeable future is so unhinged and superficial that having a mother with the same name as his is the one and only deciding factor in whether or not he ends your life. I'm not kidding. One of his very next lines of dialogue is calling himself Clark's friend. And when Bruce attends Clark's funeral at the end, the movie acts like they'd been friends for years, rather than a single night on which they also tried to kill each other. Oh, that's right, we also killed Clark off in this movie, because Warner Brothers doesn't and never has known what to do with Superman as a character, so why bother trying to capture what it is that makes people like him in the first place, and see if that works, when we can just stop for the triple whammy of trying to be sad and poignant in the most cliché way possible, bench Soups until his inevitable return in time for Justice League, and rest the future of our franchise on the only character who we've proven we know how to do right. And I would almost be all for it because acting-wise, I do think Affleck is probably the best live-action Batman, but writing-wise, I don't see how this version of the character can be salvaged. If his mother's name were anything else, Superman would have been impaled and Batman and Lex would have been equally satisfied with themselves for killing him in cold blood. And I'm supposed to want to see more of this guy? Then there's Lois Lane, who in the end is completely useless. The movie practically opens on her and gives her a goodly chunk of things to do unraveling Lex's plan, but this all amounts to nothing since Lex just has her kidnapped and explains everything in an evil monologue anyway. But hey, Amy Adams is super cute at least, so that's something. Her, Lex, Jeremy Irons as Alfred, and Lawrence Fishburne as Perry White were the only things I could consistently enjoy about this film. That and the soundtrack, which is pretty dope. She contributes about as much as Wonder Woman, who shows up for literally no reason but to give us our advertisements for the upcoming movies. No, really, without the built-in trailers for Flash, Aquaman, and Cyborg, you could have dropped Gal Gadot from this movie and lost nothing. Also, and I'm adding this in post, but the fact that I could have made this whole review without once bringing up Doomsday shows just how terrible an idea it was to include him in the first place. I mean, you think the Marvel movies are bad with their semi-forced action climaxes? This thing only exists so we can have an action scene. That is it. Lex somehow creates him by mixing his blood and Zod's corpse. What? Really, though? And I'm only realizing this as I write this down. You could have scrapped this whole movie and lost to nothing. Why? Because when all is said and done, nothing has changed. Superman is dead, but he'll be back. Bruce has given no indication that he's learned anything or grown at all, and the only thing that resulted from the events of this movie is that more city got destroyed, and Bruce and Wonder Woman are now dedicated to finding other metahumans in preparation for some totally vague but impending threat that Bruce saw in a dream. And wait a minute! I just realized that this whole movie is what happens if you take the worst scene from each Avengers film, make it even worse, then try to expand them into the plot of a whole film. This movie is terrible. I was expecting, at worst, something heavily flawed but enjoyable like Iron Man 2 or either of the Thor movies, but instead what I got was something I think is easily weaker than all of those films. I can only hope that maybe on account of it being so separate from these characters, and not having Zack Snyder attached, Suicide Squad will at least be more enjoyable and maybe restore some hope in DC's cinematic universe as a worthwhile venture. And you know, it's really a big shame because this movie looks amazing. Out of the 4 action scenes, I found maybe one of them particularly impressive, but I can at least see Superman's costume in this movie, and even compared to Man of Steel, I think this is the best he's ever looked on screen. Same goes for Batman, but the visuals do little to nothing to salvage the storytelling, which just doesn't seem to care. Everything I've ever seen or heard from or about Zack Snyder suggests that he's the type of guy who puts visuals way over storytelling in terms of priorities, and this movie is the ultimate example of that. It's really pretty, maybe even gorgeous in places, but in terms of writing, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's one of the weakest comic book movies I've ever seen. See it if you honestly think that you must, but know that I heavily dissuade you from doing so, as I don't want this thing to make nearly as much money as I feel it probably will.